How We Won by Charlotte T. Zitlow, Chapter 4. Local politics begins to change. Right up to the 60s, the Republican Party, with occasional exceptions, pretty much dominated local politics in Monroe County and in the city of Bloomington. It was basically split between two factions, but many of us had no idea that was going on. Carl Ryan, the Monroe County Republican chair, was closely aligned with the real boss, Jim Ferguson, who ran a law office, owned enormous amounts of land all over the county, and kept a low profile. Their nemesis was Republican Mayor Jack Hooker, whose team had been running the city since 1963. They differed in style and interests and ultimately clashed in court, as we will see. In contrast, the local Democratic Party was loosely organized during most of the 60s, but the 1968 presidential primary changed this definitively. Indiana was the first state in which Bobby Kennedy challenged Eugene McCarthy for the Democratic nomination for president. They were joined in the primary election ballot by a third candidate, former Governor Roger Brannigan, who was a low-key and tacit stalking horse for Hubert Humphrey. It was a bitter campaign. Eugene Clean Gene McCarthy, a congressman from the 5th District of Minnesota, was the first to challenge Lyndon Johnson. His many supporters in Bloomington would become very resentful when Bobby Kennedy got into the race. RFK had been an adversary of Johnson almost from the start of JFK's presidency. He had opposed the war, but not as clearly or vehemently as McCarthy, but he had also vigorously championed civil rights and the poor, fought organized crime, and challenged the good old Washington establishment. The first direct face-off of the two was in Indiana, where both campaigns pulled out all the stops and emotions ran high. Grassroots activity was at a fever pitch. When Martin Luther King was assassinated on the 4th of April, a month before the primary, Kennedy went to Tarkington Park in Indianapolis to face a huge, distraught, and angry crowd of mourners. His words were passionate, heartfelt, and calming, and by all accounts prevented the city from erupting in riots, as happened in 100 other major cities across the country. His campaign subsequently gained momentum throughout the state. Bobby won the state primary, but would be assassinated himself 2 months later. Eugene McCarthy had won the second largest number of delegates in the state, and it was assumed among both Kennedy and McCarthy supporters that the state party would designate Kennedy's delegates to the National Democratic Convention for McCarthy. That did not happen. The state party, with its candidate, the former Governor Roger Brannigan, having come in third, awarded the Kennedy delegate seats to Brannigan, who in turn pledged to support Hubert Humphrey at the convention in Chicago. The repercussions locally were huge. In Bloomington, this did not sit well with nearly any Democrat. The anti-Johnson forces rose together to figure out how to stop this and, if that did not work, how to respond in the long run. Both the McCarthy and the Kennedy campaigns had gathered many volunteers in Monroe County. These volunteers were organized, committed, and angry, but were mainly novices in the political organization. Now they made it their business to study the party rules and to strategize the formal takeover of the local Democratic Party. They learned that precinct committee chairs were elected, that when elected, they chose their vice chairs and of the opposite sex according to the rules which still prevail today, and the precinct chairs elected the county chair. The plan was to win the next precinct chair elections, which would be in 1970, and proceed from there. And that is what happened. Women and men who had been active in the Kennedy and McCarthy campaigns and others appalled at the state party's actions formed an ad hoc group which identified candidates for precinct chair in every district. They met with each, determined that they were ready for change, and made sure they filed for precinct chair at the appropriate time. They kept records and developed training. Kay Dinsmore had developed a sound and effective system for keeping track of voters in her precinct. She set about training candidates to keep close and accurate track of the voters in their precincts. Traditional, careful organizational methods like files with color-coded cards employed by political ward bosses for years throughout the country came to Bloomington with simple, predictable, and overwhelmingly positive results. The Democratic Party was, for the first time in years, determined to win and to institute a new approach to government. It wasn't clear that the incumbent political class saw this coming, though it was hardly a secret. Bloomington had been a relatively tight-knit community with clear differences, but everyone seemed to know their place. The white man who ran the United Fund took their responsibilities seriously. The white men in the city council saw their roles as caretakers for the people in their districts. They did their best to make decisions that they believed were wise and good, but they did not expect those under their care to chant, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" on the streets of our quiet, sleepy city. This paternalistic attitude prevailed in both parties in different ways, so the old guard was not prepared when, in the spring of 1970, a whole new group of precinct chairs was elected in the city of Bloomington. It would take several more years for the county precinct chairs outside the city to change or be replaced, however. The new Democratic county chair elected in 1970, Ed Tracy, had been brought up through the ranks by Tom Lemon, the former Democratic mayor. Tom had been a very good mayor, but had governed in the style of the good old boys and was a strong believer in the status quo. For McCarthy and Kennedy supporters, the results in the city were huge victory. This was progress. The sense of empowerment was palpable and contagious. The CGG and the Voters Union both were well represented in the precinct rolls now, and this was just the beginning. There would be another election to be won soon. The 1970 election was a midterm election nationally. Democrat Vance Harkey was up for re-election to his third term in the Senate. He had been mayor of Evansville before winning an open Senate seat in 1958. He succeeded William Jenner, a strong supporter of the famous communist-hunting Wisconsin Senator Joseph McCarthy, and an opponent of civil rights and social programs. Vance Harkey strongly advocated for civil rights and the war on poverty. He and LBJ were close allies until 1965, when Harkey vocally rose to oppose the expansion of the war in Indochina. He remained a strong proponent of the Great Society programs, especially financial aid for students, support for adult basic education, Head Start, civil rights, and transportation safety. He was an ardent supporter of veterans and chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee. By 1970, however, Indiana voters in general were more supportive of the war than those in Bloomington, and it took a strong showing in Monroe County to help Vance Harkey prevail in a very close race statewide. My precinct, which included the campus south of 10th Street, as well as residential areas, brought in a plurality of 1,000 votes for Harkey, which helped the other candidates as well. This also brought me to the attention of Ed Tracy and helped me to get more involved in the party and the city campaign in 1971. An oft-forgot issue of the 1970 campaign was the debate over food stamps. For years, township trustees had been distributing surplus agricultural commodities to the needy. These products, delivered by federal government, consisted primarily of lard, butter, flour, peanut butter, processed cheese, canned pork, and dried beans. They sustained those who were hungry, but did not offer recipients much choice or a balanced diet. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, as its contribution to the war on poverty, gradually developed an alternative, food stamps. Citizens eligible for commodities were now to receive stamps, a sort of script, with which they could go to the grocery stores and choose a variety of healthful foods, including produce, milk, fresh meat. The intent was to improve the health and the dispositions of low-income folks, empowering them to make their own decisions and to become more fit. What may sound like a clear choice now was sorely contested at that time. The City Council would be the fiscal body that authorized the new food stamps to be distributed by the County Welfare Department, where before it had been township trustees in charge of distributing agriculture commodities. Trustees, by and large, resisted ceding their authority to the County Council. Thus, there was tension between them and between those who felt that commodities were better choice than food stamps. Local nonpartisan groups, primarily the League of Women Voters and the CGG, as well as the VU, made this issue one of their primary focuses of the 1970 campaign. Under the joint aegis, volunteers went out, interviewed all the candidates for both the trustee and council offices, and reported the results. As described in previous pages, Democrats Marion Gottfried and Warren Hanginger and Republican Kathy Crittenden, all novices to government, joined very conservative county council. When the council organized its officers, Marion Gottfried was chosen as their chair of the task force that would study the food stamp issue. The first Democratic woman to serve on the county council, soft-spoken but forceful, she managed over time to gain a healthy majority in favor of food stamps. This quiet revolution had had a ripple effect in people's health and lives beyond measure over the years. The most important race, however, was probably that for county clerk. Ruth Poling Carsell was running for re-election for that office and ran a tidy but strict ship. Her publicly stated view of voter participation was the fewer people who voted, the easier it was to hold an orderly election, and she did not make it easy for new residents of Monroe County to register. University students were particularly not welcome. When Marilyn Schultz attempted to register, she was questioned severely because she was young, single female at Indiana University and who had no stake in this county visible to Miss Carsell. Schultz, who would be elected state representative in 1972, had to argue determinedly to get registered. Ms. Carsell was opposed in the fall election by Eleanor Jamie Murphy, a transplant whose husband was retired from the Navy and was working at IU in labor studies. She not only ran on a platform of voting is a right and duty, and everyone should vote who is eligible, but she also welcomed new voters. Jamie was outgoing, well-organized, smart candidate who engaged Democrats and Republicans alike. Jamie Murphy was elected in a landslide. In fact, the Democrats did very well in Monroe County in 1970, with an army of anti-war supporters of Harkey coming together with the Democrats who were organizing for institutional change. One Democrat who did not win his election in 1970 was Frank McCloskey. At the time, there were 2 seats for the state legislature in the same district, and only one Democrat, William Piercy, had come forward to run. The local Democrats scrambled to find a second and persuaded Frank, who was State Senator David Rogers' law clerk, to put his name on the ballot. Although he did so reluctantly, Frank had a strong competitive streak and an even more competitive wife, Roberta. It did not take long until Frank was campaigning with both energy and zest, and Roberta was rapidly learning the ropes of precinct organization, for which she had a natural gift. Frank had been an unknown, and he entered the race late. He was running against a candidate with a formidable local name, Jim Ferguson, Jim's little brother, and he did not win, but he made such a good showing with his campaign that when the next election rolled around, Frank was in a good position to be easily persuaded to take on the popular former mayor Tom Lemon in the primary. This was to be a definitive moment. The election of 1970 was a harbinger of things to come. In the Monroe County Republican Party, meanwhile, there was no shortage of internal stresses. Yet despite intra-party differences, Republicans seemed to be in control, holding virtually all local offices. However, widespread problems plagued the city administration. Mayor Hooker, a very hands-on fellow, envisioned the role of mayor as commander-in-chief and enjoyed playing the part, embellishing his city-issued car with flashing blue and red lights and attending as many fires and other emergencies as possible. He felt he should oversee infrastructure work, reputedly once delaying his attendance at a VIP celebration for the Boys Club Center on Kinzer Pike, where the governor was in attendance. When Mayor Hooker appeared at last, his boots muddy, he apologized for having had to oversee the emergency work on a burst water main. Hooker insisted on signing off on every single building permit, holding up the process to the annoyance of developers. Practices and events like this had undermined his rank-and-file support among Republicans and contributed to what would be an extremely close race in 1971 primary. For years, there had been internal tensions between the so-called R's and the city R's. Hooker, by profession, a high school teacher of government, had been a Monroe County commissioner when he ran for mayor in 1963. He had a philosophical bent, a vision of what he wanted the city to be. His approach was personal and intense. He was an immersive manager who interacted with all of the department heads very personally, and he perceived the role of city council to be the agent of the mayor. He had several very loyal supporters on the council, including Dr. Harry Day, Charles Bud Ferris, and Ralph Johnson, and the council as a whole did not discourage his management of it. The council had no staff, and not even a rank to hang their coats on. They laid them on the couch in the mayor's office, where they assembled for pre-council meetings, presumably to get their marching orders for their official public meetings. In fact, by the end of Hooker's second term, the council had developed serious internal ruptures, with clear and consistent dissent coming from Dick Fee and Jack Morrison, joined by the lone Democrat Bob Clennington. The county R's were headed by the official county chair, Carl Myers. Myers maintained a strong hand in county elections and a strong alliance with the boss behind the scenes, Jim Ferguson. The R's had maintained their hold on the county for many. That was where their interest lay. They were happy with the status quo, bothered by the disruptive changes that characterized the 60s, and focused on holding on. Sarkis Tarzian, owner of the successful television parts manufacturing company of the same name, was no fan of Hooker's, and he provided additional support to the county group. Hooker was just too liberal for him, and the faction of the county R chair, Carl Ryan, all supported Hooker's prime opponent in the primary. The Ferguson family was an old family, lawyers, who also owned a sizable portion of Monroe County. In 1971, Steve Ferguson was one of two state representatives from Monroe County in Indianapolis. A close law school friend, Randy Bridges, had been elected Superior Court judge in 1966, and another young member of the firm, Tom Barry, had been appointed deputy prosecutor under Tom Hoadley, and then appointed prosecutor when Hoadley moved to Florida. Their good friend and law school colleague Bill Lloyd would be persuaded to run for mayor against Hooker, who was not one of Ferguson's inner circle and seemed vulnerable. During the anti-war and civil rights demonstrations, the lock-in, the protests, and the black market fire of 1968, there were clear differences within both the Democratic and Republican parties about how local officials were handling those events. While the conservative student group Young Americans for Freedom, YAF, came on strong in the early 60s, Tom Hoadley, before leaving the prosecutor's office, perceived the real danger to the community to be Students for Democratic Society, SDS. His successor, Tom Barry, who had been a young lawyer in the Ferguson firm as a part-time deputy prosecutor, believed his main concern should be enforcing the law and not going after conspiracies and minor infractions best left to the then existing city court. While campuses across the nation were experiencing major, sometimes violent confrontations, IU students were relatively mild in their actions, and the administration, for the most part, was very circumspect in the way in which it handled their activities. Even when black students and their allies gathered in Dunn Meadow in 1969, while the Franklin Hall Library was coincidentally on fire behind them, students, faculty, staff, and the general public did not panic. The police, vigilant and armed nearby, followed the orders of the mayor and held back. The mayor, and indeed the sheriff, showed thoughtful and consistent restraint. While some warrants were issued and some fines levied, there was no spectacular counter-responses. Of course, there were some in the county who felt that was a mistake, that those kids should have been shown a lesson, but Bloomington maintained a show of force without a use of it. A big point of contention between the city and the county was the issue of planning and zoning. Neighborhood and good government groups were mounting a campaign for more land use regulation in the city, and Hooker was bowing to the pressure. The first local planning and zoning ordinances were issued by Jack Hooker. In the county, zoning was an anathema. No one was going to tell me what I can do with my property, and that led to divisiveness within the city as well. Additionally, there were differences of opinion about appropriate local relationships with the federal government. Should the city accept funds for building a highway bypass, for housing projects, for the improvement of State Road 37, the main highway to town, for the redevelopment of rundown areas such as Miller Drive? Hooker's inclination was yes. The county folks took a dim view of such collaborations. Furthermore, two major local initiatives, which involved large expenditures of money and a change in the way of doing business, were both supported by Mayor Hooker: the consolidation of the Monroe County schools, excluding Richland and Bee Blossom townships, and the construction of a new Monroe County Library on Kirkwood Avenue downtown. These were viewed skeptically by Hooker's Republican opponents, both for their cost and for the social impact. By 1969, Hooker was joining with the downtown churches to develop a plan for a high-rise senior housing center on Kirkwood. He, as mayor, took responsibility for purchasing land for the project and proposed funding for the purchase, with the installation of parking meters throughout the downtown area, including residential areas. This entire scenario met with great resistance throughout the community. At the time, a high-rise on Kirkwood Avenue so close to campus was not welcome. The parking meter idea was outrageous, intended to include residential areas, and heavily opposed. In the face of this, Mayor Hooker and the council avoided public discussion in their official meetings of the issues involved by simply not allowing the public to comment in public meetings. But he also had a problem in how to finance the purchase of the property at Kirkwood and Dunn that was to be the construction site. Time was short. Options on the land would run out and money was needed. There were not sufficient liquid discretionary funds in the city's general account, but there were funds in the city utilities account. So Mayor Hooker drew money from that account and bought the lots. Opponents of the project and even supporters who were uncomfortable with the process openly questioned the legality of that move. The State Board of Accounts found a number of irregularities but gave Hooker a slap on the wrist. However, the findings were such that the county prosecutor was obliged to call a grand jury to investigate, and the jury returned an indictment of misappropriation of funds. Both Mayor Hooker and Howard Young, his city controller, not the developer of the same name, were indicted and brought to jury trial. Prosecutor Tom Berry presented a workmanlike case but did not go for the jugular. The jury found the men guilty, but they were fined a mere $2. Another area of vulnerability for Mayor Hooker was his jealous oversight of the fire department. Hooker had deliberately set about acquiring state-of-the-art equipment, including a snorkel ladder equipped to reach 10 stories. The fact that there were just 2 buildings in Bloomington that might require such a truck made the fiscal hawks wonder at the wisdom of that expensive purchase. Meanwhile, throughout the county, fires were fought exclusively by volunteers who suffered for lack of equipment. Attempts by township trustees to enter into interlocal agreements between the city and the township's all-volunteer fire departments had repeatedly failed. Hooker did not want to enter into those contracts. This all reached a head in 1970 when the Busy Bee Bakery just over the city line on the West 2nd Street burned to the ground as the mayor watched from his post down the street at the city limit. There is always money to be spent and made in the management of government, but questions about how the money was spent, who spent it, and who benefited from the expenditure were not publicly discussed in the Republican primary. Procuring a building permit, getting the appropriate zoning so you can develop attractive property, deciding on a vendor of building products, street maintenance materials, vehicles, office supplies, cleaning services, etc., all these and many more financial issues were regarded as matters of course and not considered worth mentioning. But there is no question that they also played a role in any campaign for power. There are financial winners and losers, no matter what is said out loud. The city at the time did not have an attorney on the payroll to monitor contracts and point out conflicts of interest, so they hired a private one on retainer as needed. Furthermore, the city spread its various insurance contracts around, benefiting a number of local agents, not just one. This piecemeal coverage risked paying high premiums without assuring comprehensive coverage and without making sure that coverage didn't overlap or that all liability was covered fully. There was no one on the payroll to monitor potential conflicts of interest in this area either. The 60s were a period of time when developers were having a heyday in the city and the county. They were selling houses and businesses as fast as they could build them without having to provide curb, gutters, storm sewers, green spaces, or arrangements for parking. To the winner go the spoils is a common saying. That reality was a big unspoken stake in the election because the builders, developers, businesses, insurance agencies, gravel pits, asphalt plants, and heavy trucking equipment were owned primarily by Republicans. The competition for local government business played out primarily among the factions within the Republican, not the Democratic Party. This was a major factor resulting in the contentiousness of the Republican primary. The heady days of development following the end of World War II were done in a spirit of super spontaneous non-planning, relatively little attention to infrastructure needs, and a laissez-faire attitude towards land use. Planning and zoning would not come into their own in the U.S. until the 60s, when vigilant neighborhood monitoring became a more standard practice. As neighborhood organizations emerged, the unchallenged growth both on the edges and in the old neighborhoods of the city came into question, and political implications were emerging. And there was a question of challenging land uses. In Bloomington, the main north-south streets of College Avenue and Walnut Street were lined with imposing family homes as late as the 50s. Beautiful stone and stately wooden houses belonging to old families lined those streets from the courthouse square north and south. As demand for commercial development increased, these historic homes were torn down one by one and replaced with stores and restaurants, vegetable stands, gas stations, and parking lots. Homes were interspersed with businesses without regard to compatibility, and there were minimal building standards. This destructive juggernaut was greeted in the mid-60s with a steadily increasing drumbeat for planning and zoning. Finally, in 1968, a zoning ordinance was passed. The demand for control was so insistent that year, the city of Bloomington hired an architectural planning firm, Johnson, Johnson & Roy, from Ann Arbor, Michigan, to develop a master plan for the city. But that did nothing to change the number of practices that had become standard procedure, gradually eroding the fine housing stock in the center of the city. Realtors and developers purchased single-family homes and proceeded to request a rezoning to designate one single parcel among other city single homes as multifamily residential. These rezonings were routinely granted by the city council without discussion, and in no time. Where there had been a well-built family home, there was a now jerry-built apartment building with 16 one-bedroom units, little or no provision for parking, no green space, no noise limitation during construction, and no storm drainage requirements. Noise, congestion, water runoff, and traffic problems ensued. The center of town was rapidly transformed from family neighborhoods to a hodgepodge of incompatible construction and unsustainable lodgings. One could not help but notice the composition of the city council. It was alternately chaired by a downtown business owner, a banker, a realtor, and an insurance agent. Boards and commissions, few in number, were filled with the establishment. Clerks, office workers, or factory workers were seldom included. The governing circle was small and not noted for outreach and diversification. All this came to a head in 1970 with the consolidation of neighborhood associations into an umbrella organization called Contact. Zoning and planning would become major issues in the 1971 city campaign. Indeed, it became probably the single greatest issue. And the city council at the time appeared to be oblivious. Spot zonings were passed by title only, leaving the audience of concerned citizens unclear about which ordinance pertained to which property. The lack of transparency in the process and the lack of respect for remonstrations were increasingly badly received. People wanted a voice. They wanted their concerns discussed publicly, and they wanted business as usual to be re-examined and to take a new path.